Great, can you guys hear me? This is an extremely sensitive microphone. I'm afraid to move it any closer for fear I will blast your eardrums. Great, well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. As Mario mentioned, we served together in the previous administration. I was the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, acting in 2019 and confirmed in 2020. How many of you have heard of OIRA before? So believe it or not, there's only 3 of you. Yeah, that's actually a really high percentage. For those of you who didn't raise your hands, I'll tell you a little bit about the office. So OIRA was established in the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1980. It has many, many functions. Among them, it sets the privacy and science policy for the federal government. The OIRA administrator approves every federal form before it goes into effect. So if you filled out any federal forms in 2019 and 2020, you're welcome. But it's best known for its regulatory review role. OIRA reviews all of the most important regulations from all non-independent executive federal agencies. It does so under Executive Order 12866, issued by President Clinton. Before EO 12866, there was President Reagan's EO 12291. So OIRA review has been around since the early 80s. And the Clinton EO 12866, is the EO currently in effect. Now, I'll pause to note there are not many executive orders issued in the 1990s that still play a very important role in executive practice today. EO 12866 is one of them and is a success story for its longevity. So I want to tell you a little bit about the way OIRA review works, and I want to do so as a way of setting a common framework upon which my other panelists can speak. So OIRA review has 2 main aspects, or 2 main components. One is interagency review, and the other is cost-benefit analysis. So when OIRA receives a regulation from an agency that would like to issue the regulation, it circulates the draft regulation to all agencies or White House offices who might have something to say about it, who might have relevant expertise or be tasked with missions under their statutes that are adjacent or but the task of the proposed or final draft regulation. And those agencies give their views on the regulation. OIRA aggregates those views, sends them back to the author agency, and a dialogue between OIRA and the commenting agencies on the one hand and the author agency on the other ensues. So the role of interagency review is to take advantage of all the expertise that the federal government has available to it, and also to ensure that in each federal regulation, the government speaks with one voice. You're not getting conflicting policies, conflicting regulations from, say, HHS and DOL or Treasury. The second aspect of OIRA review is cost-benefit analysis, and of course that's the title of this panel. So I'll spend a little bit more time on that, on interagency review. Under 12866, the executive order in which OIRA review occurs, agencies are obligated to tender with their proposed regulations, quote, an assessment of the potential costs and benefits, end quote, of the regulation. For a certain class of regulations, that is to say, regs that will have, in fact, more than $100 million per year, that are anticipated to have such an effect, agencies are obligated to quantify where possible, and also to opine on the costs and benefits of potential alternatives to the regulation that they have sent to OIRA. Now, that's a pretty bare bones set of requirements. Executive Order 12866 does not provide a lot of detail about what it means to assess potential costs and benefits and to quantify them. The detail is provided principally by OMB Circular A4, which was issued in 2003, beloved by general readers everywhere, as you might imagine. OMB Circular A4 goes into great detail on what it means to assess the costs and benefits of proposed and final draft regulations. And I'll mention here one aspect of A4's many provisions, which is that even though it is possible to read Executive Order 12866 as requiring only statements of benefits and costs. That is to say, what are the good things that will happen without or on account of the regulation, or the bad things, the detriments that it will create. OMB Circular A4 makes clear that agencies also must include distributional analysis in their regulatory impact assessments or analyses. So that is to say, agencies must also explain if money or some other thing is moved from one person to another, even if the regulation is not resulting in benefits or net benefits or net detriments, it still must account for the distributional effects. As I said, Executive Order 12866 has been in effect since the 90s. OMB Circular A4 has been in effect since 2003. On January 20th, 2021, President Biden issued an important memo that could affect both the order and OMB Circular A4, in which he directed OMB to make recommendations with respect to the OIRA regulatory review process. So I'll tell you a little bit about that memo. The memo called on OMB to make recommendations with a view toward making the review process more attentive to environmental concerns, equity concerns, economic growth as well, and a number of other values. And there were 4 concrete directives. The recommendations should identify ways to modernize the regulatory review process, to ensure that it promotes policies that reflect new developments in scientific and economic understanding, and fully account for regulatory benefits that are difficult or impossible to quantify. It should propose procedures that take into account distributional consequences of regulations. It should consider ways that OIRA can play a more proactive role in partnering with agencies to promote and undertake regulatory initiatives. And it should identify reforms to promote efficiency, transparency, and inclusiveness. So, OMB has yet to produce the set of recommendations that the Modernizing Regulatory Review memo calls for. OIRA was without a confirmed head until just a couple of months ago, so I suspect that the delay is attributable to that. So one opportunity that this panel is confronted with is to help express views that may help OMB think through what the recommendations should look like. So that is the state of the world in which this panel is convening today. So with that, would like to pose a general question to all the panelists, and that is, what do you make of the Modernizing Regulatory Review memo, and what guidance, if Ricky Rivez or anyone else from OMB were here in the room, would you give for moving forward with the recommendations called for by the memo? So,
yeah, great, thank you. And everyone can hear me okay? We're all on hot mics, which we should remember. So, first of all,
if you could please just very briefly introduce yourself.
I will do. So, before I say something to Sylvia, which is complimentary, I will introduce myself. So, Michael Fitzpatrick, I am currently a partner at Brunswick Group, which is a critical issues advisory firm, a global critical issues advisory firm. But prior to that, I, for 11 years, led regulatory affairs for General Electric, and then in some strategic components for Google. So I've dealt a lot with the regulatory process from the private sector side. From the public sector side, I had the honor of serving twice in OIRA, first as a special advisor to the administrator in the mid-90s when the Clinton administration, just after EO 12866 was born. And then again, as the number 2 political deputy in the Obama administration with Cass Sunstein for the first 3 years of Obama, in which we engaged in a somewhat similar process to examine modernizing the executive order, and I'll get into that in a moment. My quick thought for Silvio is, just because you brought it up, I endorse your, I think, thesis, which is if we're really going to tackle climate change, we're going to have to look really hard at transformative technology innovation. I have little faith in human behavioral change or adequate policies to actually fix the problem on their own. And I think we are going to have to pray that that smart human beings come up with really transformational technology change to get us there. So I'll endorse that idea. It's a little bit pessimistic, but also a little bit optimistic. So back to more mundane, but maybe still important issues, which is how do we modernize the regulatory review process? A couple thoughts to build off of Paul's setup. One, I think it was significant that this memorandum came out from President Biden on the day in which he was inaugurated. Those of us who have worked in presidential transitions know that there is a very clear sequencing of presidential initiatives that come out after the hand goes up and the oath is taken at 12:01. And the fact that this was a day one memorandum from the president, not from the OMB director, is significant. It showed, at least at that time, there were people in transition and there were people in the early White House who felt very much like this was a priority exercise. They then managed, in my humble view, to shoot their feet off by not nominating and getting confirmed an OIRA administrator for 2 years, because there's no way to actually fulfill the promise of that memorandum when you don't have a presidentially appointed Senate confirmed OIRA administrator. It just doesn't work in terms of the internal dynamics of the administration. So that is, I think, to agree with Paul, one reason why we have, have not seen any public work product, any collateral, as we say, coming out of that process. That does not mean that things have not been going on. They, in fact, have. The career staff and other political officials who have been managing OIRA over the last 2 years have been working this. And there is now a confirmed administrator, Ricky Revesz, who's widely respected, the former dean of NYU Law School, someone who I know for a fact was thinking about these issues in Biden campaign policy circles and perhaps even on transition. So the administrator will come in with some ideas about what he would like to see out of this, and there is a lot of pressure to get the process moving. As I understand it, the agencies have been fully involved. This has been an inside the federal family effort so far. So that means they're working with White House offices and the federal agencies that they have influence over, which are the non-independent agencies, the cabinet agencies, if you will. There may have been some outreach to the independent agencies, but it's not as relevant because they don't send their rules to the White House for review. I would predict within the next 30 days or so, we will see something that will come out of this process. The memorandum charges that there should be public input into it. I think that will be fulfilled. There will be a public comment process on whatever this collateral is. And I would encourage law professors who have classes, think about getting your law students together who are interested in regulatory issues in the administrative state and file some comments. There's nothing that keeps, I think universities, law schools, and public policy schools should do more of that. I think students should get together with their professors and file comments when regulations are proposed or when these kinds of initiatives start. It's a great clinical moment, I think, and it actually is substantive too. I think that, it's my beautiful wife calling, we'll do that later. I think there are going to be points of tension here. The reality is that the OIRA career staff, and it's mostly career staff, and these are really honorable people who have dedicated their careers to making sure that regulatory policy is fit for purpose and is as balanced and legally defensible as possible. And they could all probably make a lot more money in the private sector, but they choose to do this because it's impactful. They are going to be very protective of the process because the process has worked. It has survived presidents named, well, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. But this executive order has done the miraculous, which is it has survived essentially unchanged through 5 administrations with presidents who are wildly different from each other, right? And so that is unique. And so there's a sweet spot that's been hit there. And I think folks are loath to crack that open too much. What I do think you could see is supplemental or additive executive orders, or maybe a single one, that lay on top without fundamentally altering what's underneath. We did that with EO 13563 in the Obama administration and also 13609, which encouraged more international regulatory cooperation. We didn't really fuss with what was in 12866, but we added new imperatives, new considerations, new priorities on top of it. And then presidents sometimes rescind those from other administrations. So we rescinded one or two from the Bush administration, which when we came in, Biden rescinded one from the Trump administration. But then we had to scurry back and actually backfill on some of the stuff we rescinded because we realized that it was actually had some important process questions in there that we needed to reestablish. We can talk again more about that when we get into the discussion. The other thing that's out for work right now is OMB Circular A4, which is a very substantive document. It's the document that Rick Belzer likes to read. I will keep it on my bedside to put me to sleep. I deal with the political questions in the process. Rick has dealt with the nitty-gritty. But it is the state of the art on how you do economic analysis of a proposed regulation. And that's no easy task. And this is I think, globally leading gold standard document that sets that out. But it like everything, I think, is subject to refreshing and supplementation as the state of the academic literature evolves and the science evolves, and frankly, as our values change and our normative questions are different. So that is out for review. I would guess that there is a lot more tension between agencies and OIRA around changes to A4, even than the executive order, because my guess is that agencies are in there with some pretty strong views about how A4 could be modified, and I think the OIRA folks, again, feel that that is the area where they have the greatest expertise and are going to hold some lines. So Ricky Rivez has a challenge on his hand. It's going to get more challenging when he goes out for public comment, and I'll end with this thought, because it draws on the way we handled it in the Obama administration. So we did it a little differently. I was working with Sally Katzen and Cass Sunstein on the transition that led into the first three years of the Obama administration. And we had a few goals. One was to make sure that OIRA wasn't killed, because anytime there's an incoming Democratic administration, there tends to be a group of people who are like, we should just do away with this. That's, I think, in my view, a very bad idea, and it doesn't prevail. And by year 3, the White House officials are usually clinging to the OIRA process because they realize how challenging it is to actually regulate around complex issues, and that there are actual costs on society as well as benefits. And here's a process that they can actually link into that helps to form sound policy and also bring all the voices from the federal government and the public in around the table, which really wouldn't happen otherwise. But the second thing we did was we opened up at the beginning a dialogue with interest groups, from labor groups to environmental groups to public health groups to business groups, just across the board, to solicit their ideas on modernization. And so it kind of reversed the process in a sense. I was there to help run that for the first 8 months as sort of the political official, and Cass was trying to get confirmed. He had like 7,000 things he'd written, 200 of which were incredibly provocative, like should animals have legal representation in court, and that's fine. He's a provocative academic, but man, that can slow down a confirmation. But anyway, he got in not in 2 years. He got in 9 months, right, or 8 months. And so we were able to kind of kick into this much quicker. And so by year 2, we'd actually issued a few executive orders once we worked around Carol Browner in the White House. She's very good at her job, and got consensus. But we really did bring the public in at the front end of the process, and there were a lot of meetings while we were in transition, and then a lot of meetings in those first few months to bring in information. I will say, the challenge always is that when you open the process up, there is a lot of input on the OIRA process and the executive order, and there are a lot of strongly held views on all sides, and they're pretty zero-sum sometimes, and you can raise a lot of expectations which are difficult to meet. at the end of the day. And so I think there is always a good deal of importance around expectation setting. I do not believe this will be a radical rewrite of the executive order, but I do think it has promised to bring some salutary and sensible additions and adjustments to the process, and those will include in probably greater emphasis or prioritization or energy around things like distributional impacts and environmental justice and other things, which this administration is, I think, very passionate about. I'll talk later about if the other place to look for this issue is what are the agencies doing on their end in response to these calls, which can in some ways be even more impactful than what the OIRA process yields. Back to Paul for further distribution of the comments.
We're actually going to circulate a detailed analysis of the distribution of opportunities to comment later, so things to look forward to. Why don't we just go down the line? So Max, over to you next.
Sure. Am I doing this microphone well? Great, thanks so much, Paul, and really to all the panelists here. It's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. My name is Max Sarinsky. I'm an attorney at a think tank at NYU School of Law, known as the Institute for Policy Integrity. We were founded, in fact, by Ricky Revez, who was our longtime executive director. And not surprisingly, given his background, we focus largely on the role of cost-benefit analysis in federal regulation and the regulatory review process. So, and I'll just quickly echo Mike's call. I run a regulatory policy clinic at the law school, and we do frequently comment on proposed regulations and changes to the to various processes involving cost-benefit analysis. And I agree that that's a great teaching tool and something that more law schools should get involved in academics. So ever since President Biden issued his memorandum on modernizing regulatory review over 2 years ago, there's been a lot of scholarly debate that's really intensified over kind of whether and how much to incorporate equity considerations into cost-benefit analysis. And this debate has often been quite lofty and sometimes a little divorced from what's going on the ground. So, on one end of the spectrum, some have called for basically revising cost-benefit analysis from the ground up to prioritize equity and minimize efficiency concerns, which have tended to drive cost-benefit analysis in the past. On the other end of the spectrum, some have said that equity is entirely inappropriate to consider in cost-benefit analysis, and it should continue to focus only on equity. And then between these two poles, there are a lot of people in the middle who have debated basically how to measure the costs and benefits of regulatory policies on disadvantaged and marginalized communities, and then how to balance those effects against the traditional efficiency concerns that cost-benefit analysis brings in. Spoiler alert, I do not have answers to these very lofty issues, but I do agree with Michael that that I think our regulatory system is unlikely to resolve these types of very lofty questions anytime soon, and I'm unsure how much OMB will crack open the nut of cost-benefit analysis, as Michael said. But I do think that there is a lot that OMB can do that's consistent with the goals of the executive of the President's memorandum, without totally revising the fundamentals of cost-benefit analysis. Traditionally, cost-benefit analysis has often undercounted the benefits both to society at large and to vulnerable communities in particular that result from improvements in health and environmental services. So I think before resolving how to consider equity as part of cost-benefit analysis, kind of in broad brushstrokes, there are more incremental improvements that we can make within the existing cost-benefit framework that will ensure that health and environmental benefits, both to society at large and to environmental communities in particular, are more sufficiently considered. And I'll just discuss two of them very quickly, which, there's a lot of empirical grounding for these two recommendations, and I think these are things that OIRA can move forward with and agencies can implement right away. So the first involves discount rates. Discount rates is a very technical term, but they actually play a very fundamental role in cost-benefit analysis. Really quickly, in economics, discounting is the process that's used to put impacts that occur at different time frames into a common present value. So generally speaking, this is not always true, but generally speaking, the costs of regulation are borne more in the near term, And the benefits of regulation, particularly environmental regulation, are often borne out over longer periods of time. Think of latent health harms from cancer, for instance, or impacts of climate change often bear out over decades or centuries. So the higher the discount rate you use, the more it deprioritizes health and environmental benefits over short-term costs to industry. And so Circular 4, it's interesting when it comes to discount rates. Circular 4 offers a lot of guidelines when it comes to certain issues, but with discount rates, it's actually extremely prescriptive. It says use these particular discount rates, 3%, 7%. And there was some empirical grounding for that at the time in 2003, but since then the ground has really shifted, and there's now actually very strong economic evidence that the discount rates used in regulatory analysis should be much lower than those that are in Circular 4. And so, this is something that federal agencies can incorporate immediately. EPA actually has begun incorporating lower discount rates in certain processes involving climate impacts. And I think this is something that it would not surprise me if OMB focused on discount rates in particular that provide Circular 4. This is an efficiency issue, not an equity issue, but it would have the effect of ensuring that environmental and health benefits, particularly to marginalized communities, are properly valued in cost-benefit analysis. And the second recommendation I'll make is for agencies to assess environmental impacts at a more granular scale and less using population-wide averages. So as environmental and environmental justice advocates surely know, the communities that are exposed to the highest levels of pollution also tend to suffer from risk factors like underlying health conditions or low healthcare access that also increase their vulnerability to pollution. So relying on population-wide averages overlooks this dynamic and tends to underestimate the benefits that these communities and society at large experience from reductions in pollution. Our granular modeling capacity has vastly improved in recent years, and the government should make greater use of it. So I'll just conclude by saying that there are many ways that regulators can adjust cost-benefit analysis to better capture the benefits that all of us, but vulnerable communities in particular, receive from mitigating pollution and improving public health. And regulators already have the tools available at their disposal to improve cost-benefit analysis in a manner that promotes efficiency, but also improves equity.
Great. Thanks. Thank you very much. Continuing down the line, Joanne.
Thank you, and is this working?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Joanne Spalding. I'm the legal director at Sierra Club, and I'm gonna, Max and I have, I think, some similar perspectives on here. I might go a little farther than he would, but I will just say in full disclosure, we sign on to a lot of letters that the Institute for Policy Integrity puts together on these issues, so we're very close in our positions. But I wanted to make a couple additional points and emphasize further some of the things that Max said. The first is that I think it's really important to remember that the cost-benefit analysis that OIRA performs is extra statutory. It's not required by the substantive statutes that the agencies implement. And so I actually totally agree with you about the interagency review process, about how important that is, and it's a real service that OIRA provides. I'm less enamored with the cost-benefit analysis, at least the way it's been implemented. And it does have this, the agencies, when they are adopting their rules, are very focused on ensuring that they're going to be able to get through that OIRA process, including the cost-benefit analysis. And in some cases, that puts undue emphasis on the cost-benefit analysis, when the statutes themselves don't require it, sometimes prohibit it, and sometimes are, might say, take costs into consideration, but it's a much more squishy, sort of policy-oriented thing. And then the second point is that cost-benefit analysis requires monetization of the costs of a regulation are usually something you can monetize. The benefits are much harder. They're, deaths, reduced asthma attacks, reduced cancer in the distant future, quality of life issues. You can monetize the healthcare costs, you can monetize the lost work time, but you can't monetize in any, really appropriate way the quality of life that somebody suffers from the health harms caused by the things that the regulations are designed to prevent. So it's just a much harder thing to put a number on. A lot of studies show that these analyses that before the regulations are adopted, the analyses overestimate the cost. Industry comes in and says, this is gonna cost us so much, and sometimes that's in good faith, and they're looking at, oh, here's this pollution control equipment, and here's how much it costs, but don't take into consideration that when you start mass producing it, the costs come down. And also, I think sometimes it's like, we don't want this regulation, and we're gonna, they might be exaggerating the costs, but the benefits are always, or tend to be minimized. And a lot of that is because they're hard. You miss benefits, and even the benefits you can quantify, you tend to minimize. But then there are benefits that you just don't even think of. And the other aspect is what Max went into detail, is the discount rate. And I would posit that you shouldn't just reduce the discount rate for benefits that are non-quantifiable, for health benefits, et cetera. You should not be discounting future benefits. You shouldn't say the life 10 years from now is worth less than a life today, or a life 50 years from now is worth a lot less than a life today. And the climate change shows how important that is, because it is effects that take place over such a long period of time. And then I would say, then also I'm just going to reiterate Max's point about that the cost-benefit analysis takes place on this macro level and doesn't look into the distributional effects. And often, the harms that regulations are designed to prevent fall on overburdened communities, where there will be sources of pollution that are harming, tend to be low-income and minority communities, also known as environmental justice communities. And the benefits might be spread, the costs might be spread across an industry, they might be spread across the customers who have to pay for a coal plant, for instance, to put on a scrubber. But the benefits are targeted at this one community. And that should be emphasized, that we need to be doing more to protect these communities. And there are other tools. So one thing that can be done is that we do cost-benefit analyses, sure, but make sure that we're also doing using EJ screening, which is a tool that enables you to look at the impacts of actions on individual EJ communities. So there are other tools out there that we could be making use of that are less, that are not like this kind of strict cost-benefit analyses that currently OIRA uses. And then I think I can save the rest of this in case we have more time for comments. So I'll wrap up there.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Joanne. Abigail, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. We'll try that again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, thank you. Okay, I just wanted some life out there and make sure you guys are still awake. It's really great to be here with you today. My name is Abigail Flemming. I have the honor of leading the Environmental Justice Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law. We advocate for and build power within marginalized communities in South Florida. I definitely feel a bit like a fish out of water on this panel, because I definitely know the least about regulatory review processes, but I will try my best as a community lawyer to share with you some of the things I'm seeing working with different coalitions. And I think we've heard a little bit about this from what Max and Joanne have shared, but the environmental justice, climate justice, energy justice movements have really morphed into a just transition movement. And the Biden administration, as Michael indicated, is focused on this. And this calls for us to, I would say, rethink and restructure our economy, right? It really pushes on the extractive economy we have and asks for a living economy. One that's power shares and is collaborative and is about well-being. So definitely shifting from extraction, commodification, that colonialism to something different. And it requires us to really promote empowered participation, making sure that there's equitable access to benefits, but also that there is restorative protection from harms. And so the different communities that I work within that are working within this movement are calling for these things, and I think there's a lot of tension when you're looking at the cost-benefit analysis. I'm not sure if the principles laid out in the just transition movement, which again call for transformative relationships rather than transactional collaboration, whether in individualism, shifting away from either-or thinking. So I think the tensions, and Joanne brought up a lot of them. How do we put a price on the priceless? How do we really value human life? Can the principles of the just transition movement coexist with cost-benefit analysis? I'm not sure, right? It's hard for me to see those two things coexisting. So I think there's going to be continued tension. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. I think a few that I just want to touch on are, and there's arguments I think both ways on this. And so I think that there's a lot of views that the cost-benefit analysis really trivializes future harms and doesn't really focus on the irreversibility of the environment and some of those harms that we couldn't bounce back from, right, when we're talking about resilience. I think another thing is questioning whether the cost-benefit analysis is objective and transparent. I think you can look in the executive order and see the language that says that transparency and inclusiveness. Does cost-benefit analysis allow this? I don't think so, because really it's looking at the individual as a consumer. One maybe that's a little removed from our moral responsibility, which within the just transition movement, that's essential. I think also it's a little bit implicit about who matters, who gets the benefits, right? People with power, people with wealth are the focus rather than those who are most vulnerable, especially when we're talking about the climate crisis. And I think overall, and the most concerning thing is it, as Joanne and I think Max indicated, it really exacerbates inequalities. So not just thinking about environmental justice, but within that just transition movement, how can we transition? How can we move from fossil fuels to renewable technologies without further entrenching historical harms and the systemic racism that is referred to in the executive order? But I'll stop there and pass it off.
Great, thank you, Abigail. All right, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Belzer.
Okay, I'm
It's
gonna stay here so that I don't get shot. I think I'm here for diversity. I'm the diversity panelist. I worked at OIRA from 1988 to 1998. I want to correct the record for a moment so I don't get attacked by my former colleagues. I am not the former chief economist of OIRA. OIRA never had a chief economist as far as I know. And if they do now, I'm unaware of it. I don't even think they have any at all anymore. But let me explain what that means. I'm going to go backwards a bit. Adding to what Paul said about the operation, most of the professional staff in OIRA are what we call desk officers. That's a term borrowed from the State Department when OIRA was formed in 1981. And the reason that came out was that the original crew of OIRA senior people came from the State Department. I suspect that they came from the State Department because they had been outed as spies. And so they couldn't work in the State Department anymore, and they came over to OIRA where you could hide pretty well. There are just far too many linkages, too many things that these all men knew.
Now I'm wondering if it was still that way in 2019 and 2020. Maybe the entire OIRA staff that I worked with were spies.
It's the senior people, not the anyway, they created this desk officer, but then they also had these economists, and then back in 1981, they had a whole branch full of economists, probably 8 or 10, something like that. Where did they come from? Well, they actually came from the Carter administration's Counsel on Wage and Price Stability. So 1981 with Ronald Reagan isn't the origin of this. The real origin is the Carter administration, which within the Counsel on Wage and Price Stability had something called the Regulatory Analysis Review Group, affectionately known as RARG. you know, in Washington, you have to have a pronounceable acronym and OIRA doesn't work that well. But anyway, so there are a whole bunch of economists because in OIRA, they were commenting on selected, they were not reviewing proposed rules before they were published, as OIRA does now. They were writing public comments on the proposal. That's a very different model for how regulatory review would operate. Michael's boss in the Clinton administration was a deputy director. So she knew that model really well, and in some sense, I think she tried to graft them a little bit, because that model worked really well, but it was only for a handful of issues. Those public comments were taken very seriously because they came from the White House. But they were also public, so if you're looking for transparency, it's sort of an obvious solution is to make the OIRA reviews public, which is something I've advocated since I worked there. All right, how did I get to even being there in 1988? Well, I became an environmental economist in the mid-70s. And this is the book that turned me into an environmental economist. The Ralph Nader Study Group report on the Bureau of Reclamation called Damming the West. You can find it at a used bookstore. I commend it for a couple maybe ironic reasons. This is produced from a strongly environmentalist perspective. And what were they identifying as problems within the Bureau of Reclamation in their benefit cost analyses? And they were identifying problems of using too low a discount rate, overcounting benefits and undercounting costs, double counting benefits whenever possible. All these problems have been well known for a long time, and the Bureau of Reclamation was doing that all the time in order to justify dams and other infrastructure projects. Bureau of Reclamation pretty much had jurisdiction over the western part of the United States. Corps of Engineers, the eastern part, but the problems with the Corps of Engineers are exactly the same. And all sorts of reforms have been attempted to try to correct this thing, but it's difficult to do. Now, fast forward to the new environmental movement, and regulation as opposed to construction of infrastructure is the way that environmental policy is conducted. And suddenly, the same people who were complaining about discount rates that were too low, and double counting of benefits and undercounting of costs, they completely changed sides. And now, they don't find that problem at all with, let's say, EPA. They find that benefits are undercounted and costs are overcounted. Well, from what I think is a more neutral perspective, the problem is that agencies have their own interests. And their interests all lie in making their either proposed projects or the proposed regulations look more attractive than they are. And OIRA's job, when it was created, was to be a brake on that. Was to provide some sort of objective review of the quality of analysis. And most of the time that I spent as an economist reviewing regulatory impact analyses was spent trying to get the analysis less wrong. Not right, that was not possible, but getting rid of the, we'll call Econ 101 errors, things that would get you a C- in an undergraduate economics course. That was characteristic. I had a discussion yesterday at the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis annual meeting about one of my favorite regulations from FDA, where they had an outbreak of foodborne illness from an organic apple juice. And what were they going to do about it? Well, it was real simple. What you would do is you would enforce the existing regulations against the violator. That's the real. They didn't want to do that. What they wanted to do is use as leverage to write new rules. And they wanted to require pasteurization of all fruit juice. Well, the only fruit juice that needed to be pasteurized was organic, because that's where the problem is. It has bugs. But they didn't want to do that transparently because the cost of pasteurization was enormous. So what they did is they divided the rule into two parts. The first is they required just a little label on the bottle. If you don't pasteurize it, put this label on. Well, the label is the food safety equivalent of a skull and crossbones. And who's going to put that label on the bottle? Nobody. What they were going to do to comply is to pasteurize. But they counted as a cost, the cost of the label. And then they came back a year later and they mandated pasteurization, and lo and behold, pasteurization was free. Because everybody was already doing it. So you had a multi-billion-dollar regulation that was booked into the system as being free. Virtually free. That characteristic it's not an unusual story. Because agencies are motivated to accomplish their agency missions. That's what you should expect. So that leads to a generic problem, a general economic problem, with the way that the regulatory process with the benefit cost analysis works. And then as agencies are monopoly providers of analysis, and they're monopsony purchasers of analysis. Now, what does that mean? Monopolies, if you remember in undergraduate economics, if you suffered through it, they underproduce. They produce a quantity way below the optimum. And they do it at a high price, a price well above what the market would normally generate. And then there's this huge rent, because they're making more money than they should be, and they fritter that away in waste. That's what monopolies do. And the reason we don't like them is because of those deadweight losses, and underproducing of the quantity. Monopsonies are different. Being the sole purchaser of a product means that you get to control the price and the quality. And nobody can interfere with your choices. So agencies, when they're doing benefit cost analysis, they underproduce quantity at too high a price, and they determine the quality and what they're going to pay for it. And those two pathologies explain why regulatory impact analysis has largely stayed static in quality for 40 years. And it's not going to change until that process is opened up and there is competition in the production, at least, of regulatory impact analysis. All right. Now, one other little, I'm going to let you in on a secret. You have to promise not to tell anybody, okay? When you hear the term cost-benefit analysis, if the speaker isn't British, that speaker almost certainly doesn't like it. If you hear the term benefit cost analysis, you're hearing from somebody who does like it. So it's a real easy tell. And so that is, I bet my limited reputation on that being almost always true. I learned it from a British economist long since dead, but his book was called Cost-Benefit Analysis, so we learned all that. But this, published in 1973 by Ralph Nader, doesn't use cost-benefit analysis. It uses benefit cost analysis. Now, why does that matter? Having cost show up first alters the debate. Cost is bad. And so if cost shows up first, you're already predisposed to not be a fan of it. The other thing is that there is a long-standing myth, I just heard it today, that costs are easier to estimate than benefits, and that's just simply not true. The reason it's not true is because most people misunderstand what cost is. Cost is not the out-of-pocket expenditures for compliance with the regulation. Properly understood, cost is what we call opportunity cost. It's the benefits foregone by having to devote resources to that purpose. So it's really benefits, what you get from a regulation. Costs really should be thought of as the benefits you have to give up. It's not cost. It's benefits. It's something you can't have because you had to do this. Now, with that in mind, that means that estimating cost is higher. So There are issues that I have with the memorandum. We haven't gotten to the problems that I want to point out to you all that I think that the memorandum overturns 40 years of practice in executive order review, centralized review. It does not ratify them, it does not reinforce them, it undermines them. And we can talk about that in the next round, maybe.
All right, great. Rick, thank you. I'll say another reason that you might use the phrase cost-benefit analysis, even if one is not British, is that one is a regulatory lawyer who came to economics late in life, such as your moderator. So I want to take questions from the audience, but before I do, I want to try to realize every moderator's life dream, which is to have a fight among the panelists. Would anyone like to respond to anyone else?
I would love to, but I don't know that it's going to be a fight. I think it may be some respectful disagreements.
One can only hope.
Yeah, and try to add some nuance to the discussion, because one of my long-time frustrations is that I think OIRA's process and the folks who work there is just so easily caricatured from all sides, and it's actually a much more sophisticated, complex, normatively infused set of conversations around what at the end of the day is still a human and subjective decision, which is what should the policy be. But what it does do is create a moment in which actually, more than any other moment in the regulatory process, the politics are pushed out, and there's a focus on more empirical questions. Okay, that doesn't mean that doesn't happen at the agency. I'm just saying the process tends to pull the conversation there, and it also explicitly includes voices from around the administration which have to be heard. And I think there's probably less disagreement on the panel about that than anything else, is my guess. So a couple things. One, Cass Sunstein, I think, just did a survey, or at least in one of his ubiquitous articles which came out recently, that actually identified all the different academic work on whether or not benefits and costs are overestimated, underestimated, and it is a spectacularly unclear situation. There are many instances in which benefits have been overestimated and underestimated, and many instances in which costs have been overestimated and underestimated, and there does not seem to be a clear through line. So I think we should all acknowledge that there should be a level of humility in cost-benefit analysis, but that doesn't mean it's without value in informing a very, very difficult set of decisions. And my experience at OIRA was that. It was not that the cost-benefit analysis, first of all, had to be of a type. It's a sliding scale of analysis that is sort of negotiated between the process and the agency depending on the complexity of the rule and the timing questions and how easy it is to produce, first. Second, qualitative considerations are explicitly allowed in this, and they work. When we worked on the ADA rule that changed every bathroom in America to create large stalls, we didn't monetize the value of human dignity for a disabled person to use the restroom alone rather than being helped by friend, family, or a stranger. We quantified the number of people we think would be benefited by this at certain cut points of different, constructs of requirements. But that seems very appropriate. We're trying to find out at certain levels of requirement how many people can we help and how often. But we didn't try to monetize it, nor did we try to monetize the value of not being raped in prison when we did the Bureau of Prisons rule to prevent sexual assault and rape in prison. Some things you just can't do, and so you don't try to do. It would be immoral. We have to try to put some value on things. I mean, things are priceless, like in a MasterCard commercial or life. Yes, my life is priceless to me. But when we're going to make policy and we are going to impose requirements on society and we only have the ability to regulate so much, we have to actually think a little bit about what is it costing to save a life. We can spend billions of dollars to save one life. That probably isn't worth it in most cases, because then we would be spending billions of dollars in every direction constantly to save a life. This is a particularly difficult issue in the area of commercial air travel, where you can impose lots and lots of costs to try to save one life out of aberrant situations, okay? But then what you're gonna do is raise the cost of air travel, and you're gonna cause people to drive, and if people drive, they're gonna die. And so these are actually quite complicated questions. And then the last thing I would say is a yes to the idea that there will be and needs to be more attention paid to complex questions of where the costs and risks fall in society. It is absolutely the case that I can bear the costs of certain regulations much more easily than communities that are more underserved or who repeatedly bear the costs of environmental harms over and over and over again. And I actually don't think that the process is in any way inconsistent with a greater focus on that, with the use of an EJ screen. I think the OIRA staff is sensitive to that. I don't think they're against it at all. And I'll be quiet now because I want others to fight.
Yes, any other responses, or even a SIR reply, a response to Michael's
Ooh, a
response?
SIR reply. It's very legal.
Others in the panel want to chime in? Mario, all right. You remember the panel ex officio?
There's also
Yes.
one up there, Paul, just so you're aware.
Well, yeah.
Question?
It's actually.
Well, Mario first.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a bad habit that I have from actually my time in government is considering myself an ex officio member of every conversation. So I just have this is a point that really fascinates me. I thought about it for a long time. It fascinates me more and more. And it came up, I think, every single person on the panel touched on it. And it's just kind of a law student question, really, which is, in thinking about cost-benefit analysis, let's take the distributional impact. Joanne mentioned concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. I have been, and President Clinton, I remember, back in the 90s, people on the other side of the political spectrum used to make good points, and we would say, I hadn't thought of that, that was a good point, seems like a long time ago. But President Clinton used to say, look, some of these regulations have very distributed benefits and very concentrated costs, and that's a problem, right? And so even if the aggregate cost-benefit analysis is some net benefit, we need to think about that. And so my question is, to what extent do these distributional kinds of equity concerns can they be roped into the OIRA process? And to what extent are they just public policy priorities of the new president who has priorities that he's going to impose on the regulatory process to shape regulation, because elections have consequences, just as Justice Elena Kagan describes in her article on the election administration. And so how do we think about those? Why are some of these EJ concerns? Why is this memorandum even talking about cost-benefit analysis? Is it trying to correct processes of the cost-benefit analysis, or is it saying, I have policy priorities that are going to trump cost-benefit analysis, and that's okay because elections have consequences?
Mario, another way to ask your question would be to ask, why can't cost-benefit analysis respond to the priorities identified in this memo in the same way that they can respond to any other set of priorities that the president has brought into play?
That's what I meant.
Who wants the question? Great, yes.
I think the answer is that the memorandum does both. It opens the door to better distributional analysis, and there's a bit of confusion about what that means. And to be clear, I don't know what was meant by the writers. But there's a difference between distributional analysis and redistributional effect. Regulations often have redistributional effects. In many cases, they're intended to do so. And those regulations are exempt from having to do regulatory impact analysis, which really doesn't help anybody, except for the agency. HHS in particular doesn't do RIAs for redistributional rules. It would be useful if they did, but it never happens. Now, distributional effects are in principle, if information were free, we'd know all the time. It's not. The right way to do benefit cost analysis is to look at each individual and to determine, to estimate that person's benefit from a rule and subtract out that person or household. Let's deal with the household level, it's easier. That household's cost. And you subtract the two, that becomes the net benefit to the household. for that particular rule. And the idea is to aggregate that across 250 million people. Well, all right, it's hard to do. But that isn't the way this is done in practice. It's never been done that way. Instead, what happens, an agency comes up with an aggregate point estimate for benefits and subtracts out an aggregate point estimate for cost, and that difference is then called the net benefit of the rule, and it tells you nothing about the impact across the distribution of the population. Well, we can do a whole lot better than that, and that's the thing I think the memorandum could be interpreted. I hope OMB interprets it that way. It says, we need to get closer to a distribution of benefits and a distribution of costs in which we subtract the cost from the benefit distribution. And the extent to which the administration wants to identify populations of concern, I'm not sure what to make of disadvantaged, vulnerable, marginalized. It is not defined, but let's call them a subpopulation that they get concerned about. That's fine. Let's do the very same thing I'm talking about for that group, whatever they are. And that is information that decision makers then can use to decide, well, should we modify the regulation to avoid really bad impacts, let's say on the poor, okay? But if you didn't know about it, you're not gonna do anything. Well, this is a way of finding out, what are those impacts? But we don't do that. And we don't do it because although Circular A4 says you ought to do it, it doesn't command anything. The OMB circular says you should do this, you should do that, and it doesn't make any distinction between things you have to do, because they're sort of benefit cost 101 things, and things that are hard. It doesn't make any distinction. So agencies largely ignore it.
No, you go first. Yeah. That's a great question, Mario, and I mean, I'll pick up on what Rick said. I mean, the idea of considering distribution as part of regulatory analysis is not new. You know, I mean, Executive Order 1266 talks about it, Circular A4 talks about it, but the guidance here in Circular A4 is quite minimal, and as a matter of practice, agencies haven't done it in a very robust or consistent way. You know, I think I don't know, others who've worked in government probably have much more insight into this than I do, but I would imagine there have been a lot of rules where distributional impacts were kind of factored into the background, even though they didn't make it into the foreground of the analysis. But, you know, I mean, I think considering distributional impacts in a robust and consistent way would give important information to regulators on how to weigh those effects. And I think, you know, more consistent guidance from OMB on how agencies should conduct this analysis can go a long way. Now that being said, there's always kind of a policy decision at the end of the line, right? So, you know, whose equities do we care about the most? Are there particular vulnerable communities that we want to promote, right? So I mean, Chief Justice Roberts, you know, he defines equity as, you know, looking at benefits to lawn care companies versus to student loan borrowers. You know, this administration may define it a little bit differently. You know, in theory, there are economic ways that one could try to answer these questions, right? I mean, there are economic functions about like the declining marginal utility of income. I mean, that it would be in theory possible to integrate that into a cost-benefit analysis. I think in reality, that's probably the economics isn't there yet, and that's just kind of such a fundamental break from how cost-benefit analysis has been performed that we're unlikely to see anything like that anytime soon. So I think what we're likely to see is, you know, if the government does this well, is, you know, robust distributional analysis performed kind of alongside traditional cost-benefit analysis, and then there's a policy question for regulators and policymakers of how much do you weigh those two things, and how, you know, whose equity do you consider the most? And I think ultimately that's sort of a policy question.
Yeah, so that's a very important point that you just made, and I want to clarify for everyone here who may be less familiar with OIRA. So the cost-benefit analysis that OIRA undertakes and reviews for the agencies, it's not an algorithm that kind of spits out an outcome, right? You don't have some sort of like large computer or some way you just put all your variables into and out comes a regulation. There are value judgments, policy judgments that just have to be made, and the cost-benefit analysis can't be for you. That's an important point.
And I think just to pick up on that, it's in my view, and I think it's been endorsed by presidents of both parties parties now for almost 45 years, that it's an important input into what is at the end of the day a subjective normative policy decision. And generally speaking, the administration's going to get the policy decision that they really, really want, and nobody at OIRA or no cost benefit analysis is going to stop them. Okay, let's just be real about that. But in many, many, many transactions, it serves as a fairly robust, somewhat objective attempt to grapple with this question, which is we are clearly imposing costs on society. Are we assuring ourselves that we're going to get adequate net benefits to justify that, which strikes me as a very, very smart thing to do. Now, it's not a silver bullet, and I'll leave with this example. And it troubles me a little bit when you're talking about Clean Power Plan versus the ACE regulation, right, which is controlling greenhouse gases for the US power sector, Obama, Trump. The entire justification for the rule in cost-benefit analysis literally inverted itself because administrations made, and I think there's arguments about which ones are better or not, but we're not going to get into that here, but let's just stipulate they changed whether it's global impact or domestic impact, what the discount rates are, and what the cost of carbon is. And by changing those three variables, you can take a regulation that was wildly net beneficial in the Obama administration, and you can turn it into one that's net disbeneficial, and then you can justify a very different type of regulation, a much less stringent regulation. Now, what that points out for everyone is the humility also that needs to be embedded in the use of cost-benefit analysis. It is not a silver bullet that is providing one version of truth. It can be influenced by policy decisions and will be influenced by policy decisions by policymakers, and everyone just has to be real about that.
So we had a question,
Can I just say one more? So yeah, that's a really good point and a really good example of the way that you can play with the cost-benefit analysis. And one of the things that the Biden executive order tries to, we'll see how it ends up playing out, but one of the aspects of it is to increase transparency of the interagency review process and the cost-benefit analysis process. And that, because it is, I've been in to meet with OIRA over rules, and there are, some of my colleagues call it the Easter Island experience, where you're just talking and you have no idea what they're thinking. Or
Everybody gets that, just so you know.
Yeah.
Even business groups.
Yeah.
Go on.
Oh, I know, everybody
They're
gets
just ciphers.
Everybody gets
Yeah.
that, exactly. And so that is, I mean, it just, like, and that's, we go in there with lawyers and lobbyists and sophisticated people, asking a community to come in and take part in that process, they don't have the background, they don't have the information. And so increasing the transparency would be really helpful, although there is the countervailing concern about slowing down the rulemaking process by having a wide open process where you've already had that at the agency. So, those two things need to be balanced, but